Brad leaned back in his chair, designer suit catching the fluorescent courthouse lights, and smirked at his lawyer loud enough for everyone to hear. Your Honor, my wife claims she needs spousal support, but let's be honest here. Sarah's never worked a real job in her life. She's been living off my income for 18 years, buying groceries with my credit card, driving cars I paid for. She wouldn't know a stock from a bond if it hit her in the face. The courtroom chuckled softly. I sat there in my Target blouse and clearance rack blazer, watching him perform for an audience that included his 28-year-old girlfriend Tom, who was recording everything on her phone like this was entertainment. That's when I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a manila folder, and slid it across to my attorney Jennifer. Inside were documents that would wipe that smug expression off his face forever. Because while Brad was busy flashing his Rolex and bragging about his dealership commissions, I had quietly built a stock portfolio worth $847,000. He was about to learn that the woman he called financially clueless had been playing a completely different game all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of our first mediation session 8 months earlier, I had ironed the same navy dress I wore to parent-teacher conferences and PTA meetings, the one that made me feel professional even though I hadn't stepped foot in a classroom since Emma was born 16 years ago. Brad had insisted we could handle this like adults without dragging it through the courts, but the way he said it made my stomach clench. I knew that tone. It was the same voice he used when explaining why we couldn't afford family vacations while he bought himself a new fishing boat. I arrived at the mediation center on Magnolia Street 15 minutes early, clutching a folder with copies of our joint bank statements and mortgage documents. The waiting room smelled like stale coffee and industrial carpet, filled with uncomfortable chairs that seemed designed to make people want to settle quickly and leave. When Brad walked in 20 minutes late, he was wearing his most expensive suit and talking loudly on his phone about some deal at the dealership. He barely glanced at me before taking a seat across the room, making a show of checking his Apple Watch and sighing dramatically. The mediator, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, ushered us into a small conference room where we sat on opposite sides of a scratched wooden table. Brad immediately launched into what I now recognize was a carefully rehearsed performance. He painted himself as the long-suffering provider who had carried our family financially while I enjoyed the luxury of staying home. According to his version of our marriage, I was a financial burden who contributed nothing but grocery bills and credit card debt. Sarah's a sweet woman, don't get me wrong, he said with the kind of patronizing smile that made my teeth ache. But she's never had to worry about making real money. I mean, she taught elementary school for 3 years before Emma was born? That's hardly a career. She's been dependent on me for everything since then. The house, the cars, the kids' activities, family vacations. I've been the one working 60-hour weeks to support this lifestyle. Mrs. Patterson took notes while I sat silently, watching my husband of 18 years rewrite our entire relationship into a story where I was little more than an expensive pet. He conveniently forgot to mention that I had managed our household budget so efficiently that we never missed a payment or overdrew an account. He didn't bring up how I had researched and negotiated better rates for our insurance, our mortgage refinancing, and even his car loans. The man who claimed I knew nothing about money had been benefiting from my financial management for nearly 2 decades without even realizing it. When Mrs. Patterson asked about asset division, Brad's confidence grew even more insufferable. He wanted the house, claiming his income had paid for it. He wanted primary custody of Emma and Jake, insisting that children needed the stability of living with the parent who could provide for them. He was willing to offer me minimal spousal support for just 2 years, barely enough to cover rent on a 1-bedroom apartment, because Sarah needs to learn to stand on her own 2 feet eventually. I listened to him describe me as helpless and financially illiterate while mentally calculating the performance of my Apple stock, which had split 3 times since I'd started buying shares in 2011. While he dismissed my intelligence, I was thinking about the dividend payments from my Johnson & Johnson holdings that had been automatically reinvesting for over a decade. When he suggested I might need to get a job at Target or Walmart because that's probably more her speed, I was considering whether to rebalance my portfolio by taking some profits from my Tesla position, which had grown beyond my wildest expectations. The mediation session ended with nothing resolved except my crystal clear understanding that Brad genuinely believed he held all the cards. He strutted out of that building like he'd just won a poker game, not realizing that I hadn't even shown my hand yet. On the drive home to the small apartment I'd been renting since our separation, I called my sister Lisa and told her we were definitely going to court. "Are you sure you want to fight this, Sarah?" she asked, her voice thick with worry. "I mean, he does make good money at the dealership, and you haven't worked in so long. Maybe you should just take what he's offering and try to move on with your life." Even Lisa, who loved me and wanted the best for me, had bought into the narrative that I was the weaker party in this divorce. It wasn't her fault. I had been so careful to keep my investment activities private that even my own sister didn't know about the financial foundation I'd been building in secret. The irony was that my discretion, which had allowed me to accumulate wealth without Brad's interference, also meant that no one understood the true balance of power in our relationship. That evening, I spread my quarterly statements across my kitchen table and did what I had been doing every 3 months for the past 15 years. I calculated my net worth, analyzed my portfolio's performance, and planned my next moves. The numbers told a story that would have shocked anyone who had witnessed Brad's performance that afternoon. My grandmother's $15,000 inheritance, which I had received 6 months after Emma was born, had grown into something that could change my entire future. I started with index funds because I wanted to learn the market without taking unnecessary risks. The S&P 500 fund was my first purchase, a modest $1,000 investment that felt terrifying and thrilling at the same time. I read everything I could find about investing, spent Jake's nap times researching companies and studying annual reports. When other mothers were watching daytime television or scrolling through social media, I was learning about price-to-earnings ratios and analyzing balance sheets. The key was starting small and staying consistent. Every month, I found ways to divert small amounts of money from our household budget into my investment accounts. $20 here from using coupons more aggressively, $50 there from making coffee at home instead of buying it. When I negotiated lower rates for our utilities or found better deals on insurance, the savings went directly into my portfolio. Brad never noticed because our checking account balance remained stable and our lifestyle never changed. By 2015, I had accumulated enough confidence and capital to start picking individual stocks. I bought shares of companies I understood, businesses whose products I used and whose financial health I could evaluate. Apple, because I could see how their products were changing the world. Amazon, because I was ordering more things online every year. Microsoft, because their software was becoming essential to everything. Johnson & Johnson, because people would always need healthcare products. The Tesla purchase in 2016 was my boldest move, buying shares at $68 each when Brad was mocking electric cars as, quote, toys for rich environmentalists. I had done my research and believed that Elon Musk was building something revolutionary. When the stock split and soared, that single investment became worth more than Brad's annual commission checks. My dividend-paying stocks provided steady income that I immediately reinvested, creating a compounding effect that accelerated my wealth building. Real estate investment trusts gave me exposure to property markets without the headaches of being a landlord. I diversified across sectors and geographies, building a portfolio that could weather economic storms and continue growing regardless of what happened to Brad's car sales. The most satisfying part wasn't just the money itself, but the knowledge that I had built something entirely through my own intelligence and discipline. While Brad was spending his commissions on expensive gadgets and weekend trips with his buddies, I was creating long-term financial security for myself and our children. Every stock purchase was a small act of independence, a quiet rebellion against his assumption that I was economically helpless. As I reviewed my statements that night after mediation, I realized that my portfolio had grown to $847,000. I owned shares in 32 different companies, had positions in 8 different sectors, and maintained an emergency fund that could cover 3 years of living expenses. The woman Brad had just described as financially clueless had built wealth that exceeded the value of our family home. I closed the statements and put them back in the fireproof safe. I kept hidden behind winter coats in my bedroom closet. Tomorrow, I would call Jennifer Rodriguez, the divorce attorney my neighbor had recommended. It was time to stop letting Brad control the narrative about who I was and what I was capable of. He wanted to play games about money and power, but he had no idea that he was bringing a calculator to a computer fight. The next morning, I drove to Jennifer's law office in downtown Riverside, a modest practice in a converted Victorian house with creaky floors and walls lined with legal books. Jennifer herself was younger than I had expected, maybe late 30s, with short black hair and the kind of sharp eyes that made me think she missed very little. She listened carefully as I explained my situation, taking notes and asking pointed questions about our finances and Brad's behavior. "What kind of assets are we looking at?" she asked, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "Joint accounts? Retirement funds? The house? Cars?" I took a deep breath and told her about my investment portfolio. Jennifer's pen stopped moving, and she looked up at me with surprise. "I'm sorry, did you say $800,000? $847,000 as of last month," I clarified. "All in my name only, accumulated over 15 years. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I'd walked into her office, she smiled. "Sarah, this changes everything. Does Brad know about these investments?" "He has no idea," I said. "He's always handled what he calls the big picture finances, but he never paid attention to the household budget or asked questions about what I did with the grocery money I saved or the refunds I got from returning things he bought impulsively. So when he's telling everyone that you're financially dependent and incapable, he doesn't realize that you've actually been more successful at building wealth than he has?" "Exactly. His whole strategy is based on the assumption that I'm helpless and that the court will see me as a burden who needs to be supported. He has no idea that I could probably buy his dealership if I wanted to." Jennifer stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the courthouse across the street. "Sarah, I've been doing divorce law for 12 years, and I've never had a case quite like this. Usually, when one spouse has been hiding assets, it's the higher-earning partner trying to conceal money from their spouse. This is the opposite. You've been building wealth while appearing to be the economically weaker party. Is that legal?" I asked, suddenly worried that my careful planning might somehow work against me. "Completely legal," Jennifer assured me. "You used marital income to make investments, but you did it openly and honestly. You just never volunteered information that Brad never asked for. The fact that he assumed you were incapable of understanding finance is his mistake, not your deception." We spent the next 2 hours going through my portfolio in detail. Jennifer wanted to understand not just the numbers, but the strategy behind my investments. She was particularly impressed by my documentation, the spreadsheets I had maintained tracking every purchase, dividend payment, and portfolio rebalancing decision. By the time we finished, she was practically glowing with anticipation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Here's what we're going to do," she said. "We're going to let Brad continue with his current strategy. Let him keep telling everyone that you're financially helpless. Don't correct him. Don't hint that he's wrong. We want him to be as confident and condescending as possible when we get to court." "Why?" I asked. "Because when we reveal your portfolio in front of the judge, it's going to completely destroy his credibility. He's asking for primary custody and minimal support based on the argument that he's the financially responsible one and you're the dependent spouse. When the court sees that you've actually been the more successful investor and that you have substantial assets he knew nothing about, it's going to raise serious questions about his financial awareness and his fitness to make decisions about the children's future." I left Jennifer's office feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement. For the first time since Brad had told me he wanted a divorce, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I had spent 18 years being underestimated, and now I was going to use that to my advantage. Brad thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but the truth was that I had been playing a completely different game all along. The weeks following my meeting with Jennifer passed in a strange blur of routine and anticipation. On the surface, my life continued exactly as it had since the separation. I dropped Emma and Jake off at school each morning, went to my part-time job at the community college library that I had quietly taken 6 months earlier, picked up groceries, and helped with homework. But underneath this ordinary existence, I was preparing for war with a methodical precision that would have impressed a military strategist. Brad had no idea that I was documenting every interaction we had, Every phone call about the kids. Every text message where he tried to manipulate or intimidate me. When he sent messages complaining about having to pay temporary support, I screenshot them. When he made snide comments about my cheap clothes during custody exchanges, I noted the date and time. Jennifer had advised me to let him keep talking, and Brad was more than happy to oblige. "You know, Sarah," he said one afternoon while picking up Jake for a weekend visit, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I feel bad for you. I really do. Maybe we can work something out where you don't have to embarrass yourself in court. I mean, what's going to happen when the judge sees that you've been living off my income for almost 20 years? It's not going to look good." I nodded sympathetically while mentally calculating how much my Amazon stock had gained that week. "I appreciate your concern, Brad. I know this is hard for everyone." "Exactly," he continued, warming to his theme. "Look, I'm not trying to be cruel here, but facts are facts. You've never had to handle real financial pressure. When we were married, if something broke, I fixed it. If we needed more money, I earned it. You've been sheltered from how the real world actually works." The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a knife. While Brad was lecturing me about financial reality, I was carrying my phone with apps that let me monitor my portfolio in real time. That morning, I had received dividend payments totaling $437 from my utility stocks alone. The previous week, I had rebalanced my international holdings and increased my position in emerging markets. But to Brad, I was still the helpless little wife who needed protection from big, scary numbers. His confidence was becoming more pronounced as we approached the court date. He started making jokes about the divorce proceedings to anyone who would listen, treating it like an amusing inconvenience rather than a serious legal matter. At Emma's soccer game the following Saturday, I overheard him talking to another parent, describing me as quote, but completely out of her depth when it came to financial matters. "The thing about Sarah is that she's never had to worry about money," he said, loud enough for half the bleachers to hear. "I mean, she's great with kids and she keeps a nice house, but asking her to understand investments or business decisions is like asking my golden retriever to do calculus. It's just not in her wheelhouse." I sat 3 rows behind him, wearing my usual jeans and college sweatshirt, looking for all the world like exactly the kind of financially naive ex-wife he was describing. But inside, I was thinking about the conversation I had with my financial advisor, Carol Thompson, just that morning. Carol, who had been my economics professor back when I was actually working toward my master's degree before Emma was born, had become both my mentor and my friend over the years. Carol had called to discuss some concerns about market volatility and whether I wanted to adjust my allocation strategy heading into what looked like an uncertain economic period. We spent 45 minutes talking about sectors rotation, international diversification, and the potential impact of Federal Reserve policy decisions on my bond holdings. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated financial discussion that Brad insisted I was incapable of understanding. "You're sitting on a portfolio that most professional investors would envy," Carol had told me. "The fact that you built this while managing a household budget and raising 2 children is remarkable. You have natural instincts for risk management and long-term thinking that can't be taught." But at Emma's soccer game, I was content to let Brad and everyone else see exactly what they expected to see. A middle-aged, divorced woman in discount store clothes who probably needed help balancing her checkbook. The disconnect between reality and perception had become almost comical, but I knew it was also my greatest advantage. The deposition phase of our divorce proceedings began 3 weeks before the trial date. Brad arrived at Jennifer's office wearing his most expensive suit and a watch that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had brought Mike Chen, an attorney from one of the larger firms in town who specialized in what he called high-asset divorces. Mike was everything you would expect from someone who charged $800 an hour, perfectly styled hair, Italian shoes, and a manner that suggested he found the entire proceeding slightly beneath his usual clientele. The deposition room was small and windowless, with a conference table that seated 6 people uncomfortably. A court reporter set up her machine in the corner, while Mike arranged his papers with theatrical precision. Brad sat across from me looking supremely confident, occasionally checking his phone and making little comments to Mike about scheduling conflicts with his important clients. When it was Brad's turn to be questioned, Jennifer started with basic background information about our marriage, his employment, and our living situation. Brad answered in a voice that suggested he was explaining simple concepts to slow children. Yes, he had been the primary breadwinner throughout our marriage. Yes, Sarah had been a stay-at-home mother who had contributed in her own way, but had never held a significant job or demonstrated any aptitude for financial management. Can you describe Sarah's involvement in your family's financial planning? Jennifer asked. Brad actually chuckled. Financial planning? Sarah's idea of financial planning was making grocery lists and reminding me when bills were due. I handled all the real decisions: investments, insurance, major purchases, college planning for the kids. Sarah was focused on domestic stuff. Did Sarah ever express interest in learning about investments or financial markets? Never, Brad said confidently. I tried to explain some things to her early in our marriage, but her eyes would glaze over. She just wasn't wired for that kind of thinking. She's more of a creative, nurturing type. Numbers and analysis aren't her strong suit. Mike Chen leaned forward, clearly pleased with his client's performance. Mr. Mitchell, in your opinion, would Sarah be capable of managing significant financial assets on her own? Absolutely not, Brad replied without hesitation. Sarah's a wonderful mother and she kept our house running smoothly, but managing money? Making investment decisions? Understanding tax implications? No way. She would need serious professional help with anything beyond paying basic bills. I sat there listening to my husband of 18 years describe me as fundamentally incompetent, and instead of feeling hurt or angry, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. Brad was building his entire case on the assumption that I was financially illiterate, and with every confident statement, he was digging his hole deeper. When it was my turn to be deposed, I answered Mike Chen's questions with careful honesty. Yes, Brad had handled most of our major financial decisions during our marriage. Yes, I had focused primarily on running our household and raising our children. No, I had never worked in finance or held a high-paying job. Everything I said was technically true, but the way I said it reinforced their assumption that I was exactly the helpless, dependent wife they expected me to be. Mrs. Mitchell, Mike said, consulting his notes, do you have any experience with stock market investments? I've learned some things over the years, I replied carefully. What kind of things? Basic concepts, mostly. I like to read about companies and understand how businesses work. Mike and Brad exchanged a look that clearly said amateur hour. Have you ever made any significant investment decisions on your own? I've made some small purchases, I said, which was true if you considered $800,000 small. What kind of purchases? Stock shares, mostly. Companies I thought were doing interesting things. How much money are we talking about here? Jennifer intervened smoothly. I think detailed financial disclosure is better suited for the formal discovery process, don't you? We'll have all relevant account statements and documentation available for review. Mike nodded dismissively, clearly convinced that whatever small-scale dabbling I had done was irrelevant to the larger questions about asset division and support. Brad looked positively smug, no doubt thinking that even my attorney knew better than to let me embarrass myself by talking about money in detail. The weeks between deposition and trial were the strangest of my entire life. I moved through my days maintaining the fiction that had defined my marriage for so long, while privately preparing for a revelation that would change everything. I met with Jennifer regularly to review our strategy and prepare my testimony. We practiced my responses to questions about my portfolio, but more importantly, we planned exactly how and when to present the documentation that would shatter Brad's credibility. The key, Jennifer explained during one of our prep sessions, is timing. We let them present their entire case first. We let Brad establish himself as the financially sophisticated partner and you as the dependent spouse. We let Mike argue that you need support because you're incapable of managing significant assets. Only then do we introduce evidence that contradicts everything they've said. I had organized my portfolio documentation into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or minimize. Carol had helped me prepare a detailed analysis showing not just the current value of my holdings, but the strategic thinking behind each investment decision. We had charts showing my portfolio's performance compared to major market indices, demonstrating that my returns had consistently outpaced professional money managers. When they see this, Carol said, reviewing the materials one final time. They're going to realize that you haven't just been lucky or accidentally successful. You've been making sophisticated financial decisions for over a decade. Your asset allocation, your sector diversification, your timing on growth stocks. This is the work of someone who deeply understands markets and investing. But the most powerful element of our presentation wasn't the numbers themselves. It was the story they told about who I really was. Every stock purchase represented research and analysis that Brad insisted I was incapable of performing. Every dividend reinvestment showed patience and long-term thinking that contradicted his portrayal of me as impulsive and financially naive. Every portfolio rebalancing decision demonstrated exactly the kind of sophisticated judgment that he claimed I lacked. 3 days before the trial, Brad made his final attempt to pressure me into settling out of court. He called and asked to meet for coffee, suggesting that we could work things out like reasonable adults without putting the kids through a court battle. I agreed to meet him at Bean There Cafe, the little coffee shop near downtown where I had first started reading financial newspapers during Emma's piano lessons years earlier. Brad arrived 20 minutes late, dressed casually but still wearing his expensive watch and designer sunglasses. He ordered an elaborate espresso drink that cost more than I usually spent on groceries for 2 days, then sat across from me with an expression that he probably thought looked sympathetic and concerned. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our situation, and I want you to know that I don't want to hurt you," he began. "I know this whole process has been confusing and overwhelming for you." I nodded and sipped my regular coffee, waiting to hear what he thought was his final winning argument. "Here's the thing," he continued. "When we go to court on Monday, it's going to be embarrassing for you. Mike's going to have to present evidence about our finances. And it's going to be very clear that you've been dependent on my income for our entire marriage. The judge is going to see that you've never held a real job, never managed significant money, never made important financial decisions." He paused, presumably to let the weight of this terrible fate sink in. "But I don't want to humiliate you," he said magnanimously, "so I'm prepared to make you a better offer. $12,000 a year in support for 3 years instead of 2, and I'll let you keep your car and your furniture. In exchange, you don't fight me on custody or the house, and we can both move on with our lives." I set down my coffee cup and looked at him carefully. Brad genuinely believed he was being generous. In his mind, he was offering charity to someone who had no other options, saving me from the embarrassment of having my financial incompetence exposed in public court proceedings. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said quietly. "Can I think about it over the weekend?" "Of course," Brad said, clearly pleased with himself. "Just remember, Sarah, once we're in front of that judge, things are going to get unpleasant. I don't want to see you get hurt, but I have to protect my own interests and the kids' future." I watched him walk out of the coffee shop, confident that he had just solved his divorce problem with minimal cost and maximum benefit to himself. He had no idea that he had just delivered the perfect closing argument for my case. His assumption that court proceedings would be embarrassing for me, his certainty that financial evidence would work in his favor, his casual dismissal of my capabilities, all of it was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. That evening, I called Jennifer to confirm our final preparations. We reviewed the timeline for presenting my portfolio documentation and practiced my responses to the questions we expected from Mike Chen. Jennifer was excited in the way that trial attorneys get when they know they have a winning hand, but she also made sure I understood what was about to happen. "Sarah, when we reveal your investment portfolio tomorrow, it's going to change your life," she said. "Not just legally, but personally. You're about to step out of a role you've been playing for 18 years. There's no going back to being the person Brad thinks you are." I thought about that conversation as I put Emma and Jake to bed that night. For their entire lives, they had seen me as Brad saw me, the supportive background parent who managed household logistics while their father handled the important stuff. Tomorrow, they would learn that their mother had been quietly building wealth and making sophisticated financial decisions throughout their childhood. I wasn't sure how they would process that revelation, but I knew it was time for all of us to start living with the truth instead of the comfortable fiction that had defined our family. I laid out my clothes for court the next morning, choosing a simple navy dress and low heels that would look professional without being flashy. I wanted to appear exactly as Brad expected me to appear: modest, unassuming, and slightly overwhelmed by the formal legal proceedings. The last thing I did before going to sleep was check my portfolio one final time. My investments had gained another $4,000 that day. By tomorrow afternoon, everyone would know that the financially helpless ex-wife had actually been the more successful investor all along. The Riverside County Family Court building was an imposing structure of concrete and glass that looked like it had been designed to intimidate people into settling their disputes before walking through its doors. I arrived 30 minutes early and sat in my car, watching other families arrive for their own hearings. Everyone looked nervous and slightly defeated, like patients waiting for medical procedures they couldn't afford, but couldn't avoid. Jennifer met me in the lobby at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase that contained the documentation that would change everything. She looked confident and focused, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that made her appear older and more authoritative than her 38 years. We had worked together for months preparing for this moment, and now it was time to execute the plan we had refined down to every last detail. "Ready?" she asked, and I nodded. Brad was already in the courtroom when we entered, sitting with Mike Chen at the plaintiff's table and radiating the kind of casual confidence that comes from believing you hold all the winning cards. He was wearing his best suit and had gotten a fresh haircut for the occasion. Tom was sitting in the gallery behind him, dressed in a tight skirt and taking pictures with her phone until the bailiff told her to put it away. Judge Patricia Williams entered promptly at 9:30. A woman in her mid-50s with graying hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had seen every possible variation of human foolishness during her years on the bench. She reviewed the case file briefly, then looked up at both attorneys with an expression that clearly communicated her desire to get through the morning's business efficiently and without drama. Mike Chen stood to present Brad's case, and for the next hour I listened to a detailed presentation about my own inadequacies. According to Mike's narrative, I was a well-meaning but fundamentally incapable woman who had been sheltered from financial reality throughout my marriage. Brad had been the responsible provider who made all the important decisions while I focused on domestic duties that, while valuable, did not prepare me for the complex realities of managing money or supporting myself independently. "Your Honor," Mike concluded, "Mr. Mitchell is not trying to be ungenerous to his ex-wife. He recognizes that Mrs. Mitchell will need support as she transitions to independence. But the evidence clearly shows that she lacks the experience and aptitude necessary to manage significant assets. Mr. Mitchell's request for primary custody and limited spousal support reflects the financial realities of their respective situations." Brad took the stand and repeated the same themes he had been developing for months. He portrayed himself as a patient, hard-working husband who had tried to include me in financial discussions, but had been forced to handle everything himself when it became clear that I simply couldn't grasp complex concepts. He spoke about my lack of work experience, my unfamiliarity with investment principles, and my general need for guidance in financial matters. "I love Sarah, and I want her to be okay," he testified. "But she's going to need a lot of help learning how to manage money on her own. She's never had to worry about anything beyond household expenses." When Mike finished his presentation, Judge Williams turned to Jennifer and asked if we were ready to present our response. Jennifer stood, walked to the center of the courtroom, and smiled. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mrs. Sarah Mitchell to the stand." I walked to the witness stand with the same measured pace I had used for 18 years when crossing our kitchen to serve Brad his dinner. My hands were steady as I placed my left hand on the Bible and raised my right hand to take the oath. The bailiff's voice seemed to echo from somewhere far away as I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I was about to do exactly that. Jennifer approached the witness stand carrying a slim folder that contained my financial statements, but she didn't open it immediately. Instead, she began with questions that seemed designed to reinforce everything Brad and Mike had just told the court about my domestic role and limited work experience. I answered honestly about my years as a stay-at-home mother, my brief teaching career before Emma was born, and my recent part-time position at the community college library. "Mrs. Mitchell," Jennifer said, "during your marriage, who typically handled major financial decisions?" "Brad did," I replied. "He managed our checking accounts, made decisions about large purchases, and handled what he called the family's financial planning." Did you have any involvement in investment decisions during your marriage? Not in the decisions Brad made, no. Mike Chen was leaning back in his chair, looking satisfied with this line of questioning. Brad was nodding slightly, as if my testimony was confirming everything he had told people about our relationship. From his perspective, this was going exactly as expected. His financially naive ex-wife was admitting her limitations in front of a judge who would soon award him primary custody and minimal support obligations. Mrs. Mitchell, Jennifer continued, you mentioned that you weren't involved in the investment decisions that Brad made. Did you make any investment decisions of your own during your marriage? I paused, feeling the weight of 18 years of silence about to lift. Yes, I did. Can you tell the court about those decisions? I began investing small amounts of money in 2010, shortly after my grandmother passed away, and left me a small inheritance. I started with index funds and gradually expanded into individual stocks and other investments. Mike Chen's pen stopped moving. Brad's confident expression faltered slightly, but he still looked more puzzled than concerned. Neither of them had processed what I was actually saying yet. How small was this inheritance, Mrs. Mitchell? $15,000. And what happened to that money? I invested it, along with additional money I saved from our household budget over the years. Judge Williams leaned forward in her chair, suddenly more interested in the proceedings. Mrs. Mitchell, when you say you saved money from the household budget, can you be more specific? I became very efficient at managing our household expenses, I explained. When I found ways to reduce our costs for groceries, utilities, insurance, or other necessities, I invested the savings. When I received rebates or returns on items Brad purchased impulsively, I invested those amounts as well. Over how many years did you do this? Jennifer asked. Approximately 15 years. And what is the current value of these investments? I took a deep breath and spoke clearly enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. As of last month, my investment portfolio is worth $847,000. The silence that followed was absolute. Mike Chen's mouth actually fell open. Brad turned in his chair to stare at me, as if I had just announced that I was secretly an astronaut. Tom made a small gasping sound from the gallery. Even Judge Williams blinked several times before making a note on her papers. Mike Chen recovered first, standing up with an objection that came out as more of a sputter. Your Honor, this is... We weren't provided with any documentation about assets of this magnitude during discovery. Jennifer smiled and opened her folder. Your Honor, Mrs. Mitchell's investment accounts are held solely in her name and were properly disclosed in our financial statements filed with the court last month. Defense counsel received copies of all relevant documentation. Mike Chen frantically shuffled through his papers while Brad leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. I could see the exact moment when Mike found the financial disclosure forms that his team had clearly dismissed as irrelevant. His face went through a fascinating progression of expressions as he realized that the line item he had probably assumed was a typo or clerical error was actually an accurate representation of assets worth more than most people's houses. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Williams said, these are substantial assets. Can you explain to the court how you accumulated this wealth without your husband's knowledge? Brad knew I was investing, I clarified. He just never asked about the details or the results. When I tried to discuss my research or share information about companies I was considering, he would tell me that investing was too complicated for me to understand. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up. Jennifer approached the bench with a thick folder. Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence Mrs. Mitchell's complete investment records, including purchase dates, transaction histories, and portfolio performance analysis prepared by her financial advisor. Judge Williams accepted the folder and began reviewing the documents while the courtroom waited in tense silence. I watched Brad's face as the reality of the situation slowly sank in. The woman he had just finished describing as financially helpless had not only been investing successfully for 15 years, but had accumulated wealth that exceeded his own net worth by a significant margin. Mrs. Mitchell, the judge said, looking up from the papers, these records show that you've been making investment decisions independently for over a decade. Can you walk the court through your investment strategy? This was the moment I had been preparing for with Carol's help. I explained how I had started with broad market index funds to learn about market behavior and risk management. I described my research process for selecting individual stocks, how I analyzed company financials, and competitive positioning before making purchases. I detailed my approach to diversification across sectors and asset classes, and my systematic method for rebalancing my portfolio quarterly. I focused on companies with strong competitive advantages and consistent growth potential, I explained. I reinvested all dividends automatically to take advantage of compounding returns, and I maintained a long-term perspective even during market downturns. Can you give the court specific examples of your investment decisions? I purchased Apple stock in 2011 when it was trading at around $45 per share before adjusting for splits. I believed their product ecosystem was creating sustainable competitive advantages. I bought Amazon shares in 2012 because I could see how e-commerce was changing retail behavior. I invested in Tesla in 2016 because I thought electric vehicles represented the future of transportation. Judge Williams was taking detailed notes. And these investments have performed well? My portfolio has averaged annual returns of approximately 12% over the 15-year period, compared to about 10% for the S&P 500 index during the same time frame. The mathematical implications of what I was saying began to register around the courtroom. I hadn't just been lucky with a few stock picks. I had been consistently outperforming professional money managers for over a decade, while appearing to be exactly the kind of financially naive person who would need professional help to balance a checkbook. Mike Chen stood up again, clearly grasping for some way to damage my credibility. Your Honor, I'd like to question Mrs. Mitchell about these alleged investment activities. Proceed, Judge Williams said. Mike approached the witness stand with the aggressive posture of a prosecutor, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes. His entire case strategy had been built on the assumption that I was financially incompetent, and now he was trying to improvise a cross-examination that could somehow minimize the impact of evidence that contradicted everything his client had told him. Mrs. Mitchell, you claim to have made these investment decisions independently, but isn't it true that you had professional help managing this portfolio? I worked with a financial advisor, Carol Thompson, who helped me understand various investment options and provided guidance on portfolio allocation. But all purchase and sale decisions were mine. And this Carol Thompson, she's a professional money manager? She's a financial advisor, but she's also a personal friend. Carol was my economics professor when I was working toward my master's degree before Emma was born. Mike paused, clearly not expecting this answer. You were working toward a master's degree? Yes, in economics with a focus on financial markets. I completed about half the coursework before Emma was born, and I decided to focus on raising our children. I watched Brad's face as this information registered. During all his testimony about my inability to understand complex financial concepts, he had apparently forgotten that I had been studying economics at the graduate level when we first got married. Or perhaps he had never really paid attention to what I was studying in the first place. Mrs. Mitchell, Mike continued, even if we accept that you made these investment decisions, isn't it true that you were using marital funds without your husband's knowledge or consent? I used money that I saved from our household budget, through efficient spending and careful management. Brad never expressed interest in how I managed household expenses, and he never asked about money that I saved or how I used those savings. But you deliberately concealed the extent of these investments from your husband. I never concealed anything, I said calmly. Brad knew I was investing. He received statements from our bank showing transfers to my investment accounts. He could have asked about my portfolio at any time, but he consistently told me that finance was too complicated for me to understand. I stopped discussing my investments with him because he made it clear he wasn't interested in hearing about them. Judge Williams interrupted. Mr. Chen, do you have evidence that Mrs. Mitchell actively concealed these investments or prevented her husband from accessing information about them? Mike shuffled through his papers again, clearly hoping to find something that would support his improvised theory about financial deception. Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell was unaware of the extent of these holdings. Being unaware is not the same as being deceived, the judge pointed out. Mrs. Mitchell has testified that her husband knew she was investing but chose not to inquire about the details. Unless you have evidence of active concealment, I don't see how this line of questioning is relevant. Mike Chen returned to his table looking defeated. and I could see him having a whispered but heated conversation with Brad. Jennifer stood for redirect examination, and I knew she was about to deliver the final blow to Brad's credibility. Mrs. Mitchell, during your marriage, did your husband ever ask for your input on financial decisions? Very rarely. When he did, he would usually dismiss my suggestions as impractical or uninformed. Can you give the court an example? In 2018, I suggested that we refinance our mortgage to take advantage of lower interest rates. Brad told me that refinancing was too complicated for me to understand, and that I should leave financial decisions to him. I researched the process anyway and found a lender offering rates that would have saved us nearly $300 per month. What happened when you presented this information to your husband? He said he would look into it, but he never followed up. We continued paying the higher rate until we separated. Mrs. Mitchell, based on your experience managing your investment portfolio, do you feel capable of handling significant financial assets independently? Yes, I do. I've been doing it successfully for 15 years. Jennifer returned to her table, and Judge Williams called for a recess before final arguments. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I saw Brad staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or hurt, or even surprise. It was the look of someone who was realizing that a fundamental assumption about reality had been completely wrong. During the recess, Mike Chen and Brad huddled in urgent conversation, while Tom sat behind them looking confused and increasingly agitated. I could only imagine what Brad was thinking as he processed the revelation that his financially helpless ex-wife had been more successful at building wealth than he had been throughout their entire marriage. Jennifer and I reviewed our final argument while sitting in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Sarah, what just happened in there was devastating to their case, she said. Brad spent an hour testifying about your financial incompetence, and then you demonstrated exactly the opposite. The judge is going to have serious questions about his judgment and his credibility. When court reconvened, Mike Chen presented his closing argument with notably less confidence than he had shown that morning. He tried to argue that my investment success was somehow irrelevant to questions about custody and support, but his argument sounded weak even to me. How could Brad be trusted to make important decisions about the children's future when he had completely misjudged his wife's capabilities for 18 years? Jennifer's closing argument was systematic and devastating. She walked through Brad's testimony about my supposed financial incompetence, then contrasted it with the evidence of my actual investment performance. She pointed out that I had been the more successful investor throughout our marriage, that I had demonstrated consistent sound judgment in financial matters, and that Brad's complete unawareness of my capabilities raised serious questions about his understanding of our family's true financial situation. Your Honor, Jennifer concluded, Mr. Mitchell has asked this court to award him primary custody and minimal support based on his claim that he is the financially responsible parent, and Mrs. Mitchell is incapable of managing significant assets. The evidence shows exactly the opposite. Mrs. Mitchell has demonstrated superior financial judgment and has accumulated substantial wealth through careful planning and disciplined investing. Meanwhile, Mr. Mitchell has shown himself to be so unaware of his family's financial situation that he didn't even realize his wife had been building wealth for over a decade. Judge Williams took less than 30 minutes to reach her decision. When she returned to the courtroom, her expression was serious, but not unkind. She began by acknowledging that divorce cases often involved conflicting narratives about the contributions and capabilities of each spouse, but that this case presented some unusual circumstances that required careful consideration. Mr. Mitchell, she said, looking directly at Brad, you testified that your wife lacks the experience and aptitude to manage significant financial assets. However, the evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Mitchell has been successfully managing a substantial investment portfolio for 15 years. Her portfolio performance indicates sophisticated understanding of financial markets and disciplined investment strategy. She turned to address both attorneys. The court finds that Mrs. Mitchell has demonstrated the financial knowledge and experience necessary to manage significant assets independently. Furthermore, Mr. Mitchell's lack of awareness regarding his wife's investment activities raises questions about his understanding of the family's overall financial situation. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and decisive. She awarded joint custody with equal parenting time, rejecting Brad's request for primary custody. She ordered the family home to be sold with proceeds divided equally, despite Brad's argument that his income had paid for it. Most significantly, She denied Brad's request for minimal spousal support, instead ordering that no support would be paid by either party, given that both spouses had demonstrated the ability to support themselves financially. Mrs. Mitchell's substantial assets and demonstrated financial acumen make spousal support unnecessary, Judge Williams concluded. The court finds that both parties have the resources and capability to maintain independent households. As the judge's words sank in, I watched Brad's face go through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so revealing. The man who had walked into court expecting to pay minimal support to his helpless ex-wife was learning that his supposedly incompetent spouse had actually been the more successful investor all along. The courtroom began to empty, but I remained seated for a moment, letting the reality of what had just happened wash over me. For 18 years, I had allowed Brad to define me as someone who needed his protection and guidance. Today, I had finally told the truth about who I really was and what I was capable of achieving. Jennifer packed her briefcase with satisfaction evident in every movement. Sarah, I've been practicing law for 12 years, and I've never seen a case turn around like that. When you revealed the portfolio, I thought Mike Chen was going to pass out. I stood up and gathered my purse, feeling lighter than I had in months. As we walked toward the courtroom exit, I passed Brad and Mike Chen, who were still sitting at their table in what appeared to be shocked silence. Brad looked up as I passed, and for a moment our eyes met. I had expected to see anger or resentment, but instead I saw something that looked almost like respect. "Sarah," he said quietly, and I stopped. "Yes? I never knew," he said, and there was something in his voice that I hadn't heard in years. It might have been humility. "I know," I replied, and walked out of the courthouse into the bright California sunshine. Outside, Jennifer and I stood on the courthouse steps while she explained the next steps in finalizing our divorce decree. But I was only half listening, because for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I was thinking about my future instead of my past. The woman who had walked into that courthouse this morning had been defined by 18 years of being underestimated and dismissed. The woman walking out was someone entirely different. That evening, I called Carol to share the news about the court ruling. She laughed with delight when I described Mike Chen's expression during my testimony about Tesla stock and Brad's face when I explained my investment strategy. "You know what this means, don't you?" Carol said. "You're not just financially independent now. You're free to be the person you've always been instead of the person others expected you to be." I looked around my small apartment, which would soon be replaced by something I chose entirely for myself. My laptop was open on the kitchen table, showing my portfolio's performance for the day. My investments had gained another $2,000 while I was in court, a reminder that my financial security would continue growing regardless of what anyone else thought about my capabilities. For the first time since Brad had announced he wanted a divorce, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I had proven to myself and to everyone else that I was exactly as capable as I had always believed I was. The only difference was that now I would never again let anyone convince me otherwise. The weeks following the court ruling passed in a blur of paperwork, real estate meetings, and the strange sensation of rebuilding a life that had been on hold for 18 years. The house sold faster than anyone expected, to a young couple with twin toddlers who reminded me of Emma and Jake at that age. I found myself genuinely happy for them as they walked through the rooms where I had raised my children, seeing possibility instead of the painful memories that had made me eager to let the property go. My share of the house proceeds, combined with my investment portfolio, meant that I was suddenly wealthier than I had ever imagined possible. The numbers on my bank statements seemed almost fictional, like props in a movie about someone else's life. But Carol reminded me during one of our regular coffee meetings that wealth was simply a tool, and the real question was what I planned to build with it. Emma and Jake had taken the divorce revelations better than I had feared, though I could see them processing the information in different ways. Emma, at 16, was fascinated by the stock market aspect of the story, and had started asking me to explain how I had researched different companies. Jake, at 14, seemed more interested in the fact that his father had been so dramatically wrong about his mother's capabilities. "Mom," Jake said one evening while we were making dinner together in my new kitchen, "did you always know you were good at investing, or did you learn it?" It was a more sophisticated question than I had expected from a 14-year-old, and I considered my answer carefully. I think I always had an aptitude for understanding how businesses work and thinking about long-term trends, I said. But I definitely had to learn the technical aspects of investing. The important thing was that I was curious and willing to study. Why didn't you tell Dad about it? I tried to early on, but he wasn't interested in hearing about it, and eventually I just stopped bringing it up. Sometimes when people have strong assumptions about what you can and can't do, it's easier to work quietly than to fight about it. Emma looked up from her homework at the kitchen table. That's kind of messed up, though. He should have wanted to know about something you were good at. I paused in my chopping of vegetables, struck by the simple clarity of my teenage daughter's observation. You're right. It was messed up, but I learned something important from it. You can't let other people's assumptions limit what you're capable of achieving. The conversation reminded me of how much my relationship with both children had changed since the divorce. When I was married to Brad, I had been the background parent, the one who handled logistics and daily care while he provided what we all accepted as the important guidance about their futures. Now they were seeing me as someone who had built something significant on her own, someone whose advice might be worth taking seriously. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I enrolled in a graduate program in finance at the University of California, Riverside, completing the master's degree I had abandoned when Emma was born. At 42, I was older than most of my classmates, but I found that my practical investment experience gave me insights that complemented the theoretical knowledge I was gaining. My professors were impressed by my portfolio performance and my ability to connect academic concepts to real-world market behavior. One of them, Dr. Patricia Martinez, who taught a course on behavioral finance, suggested that I consider pursuing a PhD and eventually teaching at the university level. You have a rare combination of practical experience and analytical thinking, she told me, after I had presented a case study on my Tesla investment decision. Have you ever considered that your experience as someone who succeeded while being underestimated might be valuable to other students? The idea had never occurred to me, but it resonated in a way that surprised me. I had spent so many years being dismissed as intellectually lightweight that I had never considered that my experience might actually be worth sharing with others. Jennifer Rodriguez and I had become genuine friends during the divorce process, and she helped me navigate some of the legal and financial complexities of my new situation. When I told her about my graduate school plans, she laughed with delight. Sarah, do you realize how many women I represent who have been told they're not smart enough or capable enough to handle their own finances? You could be exactly the kind of role model they need to see. Jennifer's words planted a seed that grew into something I hadn't expected. I started volunteering at a local women's resource center, teaching basic financial literacy classes to women who were going through divorces or escaping abusive relationships. Many of them had been told, like I had been, that they were too stupid or too emotional to understand money and investing. The first class one taught was terrifying. I had prepared extensively, but I was still nervous about speaking in front of a group about something that had been private for so long. But as I looked around the room at 12 women who had been systematically convinced that financial management was beyond their capabilities, I felt a familiar sense of quiet determination. I want to start by telling you something that might surprise you, I began. For 15 years, I let my husband believe that I was financially incompetent. I let him think that I couldn't understand investing or make important money decisions. Meanwhile, I was quietly building a stock portfolio that eventually became worth more than our house. The room was completely silent, and I could see the women processing this information with a mixture of surprise and hope. I'm not telling you this to brag, I continued. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that what other people believe about your capabilities has nothing to do with what you're actually capable of achieving. And I want to teach you some basics about investing that can help you build financial security for yourselves and your children. Over the following months, I refined my presentation and expanded the curriculum to cover everything from basic budgeting to retirement planning. Word spread, and I started getting requests to speak at other organizations. The local community college asked me to teach a continuing education course on personal finance. A women's business group invited me to speak at their monthly meeting. Each time I told my story, I saw the same reaction in the audience. Women who had been told they were too emotional or too scatterbrained to handle money would sit up straighter when they realized that someone who looked like them, someone who had faced similar dismissals, had succeeded in building substantial wealth. Emma started attending some of my presentations, and I could see her pride in watching her mother command a room full of adults. But more importantly, I could see her absorbing the lesson that women didn't have to accept other people's limitations on their potential. "Mom," she said after one particularly well-received presentation, "I want to learn everything you can teach me about investing. I don't want to ever be in a situation where someone thinks I can't handle my own money." That conversation led to Emma becoming my unofficial research assistant. She helped me analyze companies, tracked market trends, and even made some small investments of her own using money from her part-time job. Watching her confidence grow as she learned to evaluate financial information was one of the most satisfying experiences of my entire life. Jake, meanwhile, had developed his own interest in business and entrepreneurship. He started a small lawn care service in our neighborhood and came to me for advice on pricing, customer service, and managing his earnings. The boy who had once seen his father as the family's financial authority now turned to his mother for guidance about business decisions. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into Brad at Emma's school play. He was there with Tom, who looked uncomfortable in the academic setting and kept checking her phone during the performance. Brad and I found ourselves standing next to each other during intermission, and for the first time since the courthouse, we had an opportunity to talk privately. "Sarah," he said, "I owe you an apology, a real one." I looked at him carefully. He seemed different somehow, less confident and more thoughtful than I remembered from our marriage. "I've been thinking about what happened in court," he continued, "about how wrong I was about you. And I realized that I wasn't just wrong about your investing, I was wrong about who you are as a person." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 18 years I treated you like you were less intelligent than you actually are. I dismissed your ideas, I didn't listen to your opinions, and I made assumptions about what you were capable of that were completely unfair." It was the most honest thing Brad had said to me in years, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by his acknowledgement. "I think we both played roles that weren't really us," I said. "You needed to feel like the expert, and I let you because it was easier than fighting about it. But that doesn't excuse the way you talked about me, especially toward the end." "You're right," he said, "and I'm sorry for that too. Tom keeps asking me how I could have been so wrong about you. And honestly, I don't have a good answer. I think I saw what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Emma interact with her friends before the second act began. She was animated and confident, clearly comfortable being the center of attention as she explained something to a group of her classmates. "She's going to be formidable," Brad said, and I could hear both pride and slight apprehension in his voice. "Yes, she is," I agreed. "And she's going to know exactly what she's worth." A year after the divorce, I was invited to speak at a women's conference in Los Angeles about financial empowerment. The organizers had heard about my story and wanted me to address an audience of several hundred women about building wealth and overcoming others' assumptions about their capabilities. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience full of women who had their own stories of being underestimated and dismissed, I felt the full weight of how much my life had changed. 2 years earlier, I had been sitting in a mediation room listening to my husband describe me as financially helpless. Now, I was being asked to share my expertise with women who were looking for inspiration and practical guidance. "I want to tell you about the day I realized that the person who believed in me least was me," I began. I had been building wealth for over a decade, making sophisticated investment decisions and outperforming professional money managers. But I was still letting my husband treat me like I was too stupid to understand basic financial concepts. The audience was completely focused, and I could see women throughout the room nodding in recognition. The moment I stopped accepting other people's definitions of my capabilities was the moment my real life began, I continued. Not because I suddenly became more intelligent or more capable, but because I finally started acting like the person I had always been. After my presentation, women lined up to talk with me. They shared their own stories of being told they weren't smart enough or capable enough to handle financial decisions. They asked for advice about starting their own investment portfolios, about standing up to dismissive partners, about believing in themselves when others didn't. One woman, probably in her early 30s, waited until the end of the line to approach me. She was carrying a small notebook and looked nervous but determined. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "I'm going through a divorce right now, and my husband keeps telling me that I'll never be able to support myself because I don't understand how money works. But I've been saving small amounts from my grocery budget for 3 years, and I've been researching stocks online. I think I want to start investing, but I'm scared." I looked at her notebook, which I could see was filled with careful notes about different companies and investment strategies. She reminded me of myself 15 years earlier, curious and determined but lacking confidence in her own judgment. "What companies have you been researching?" I asked. She opened her notebook and showed me pages of analysis about technology companies, healthcare stocks, and consumer goods businesses. Her research was thorough and thoughtful, exactly the kind of careful preparation that leads to successful investing. "This is excellent work," I told her. "You clearly understand how to evaluate companies and think about long-term investment potential. Trust your research and start small. You're more ready than you think you are." The smile that spread across her face was radiant. "Really? You think I can do this?" "I know you can do this," I said. "The question is whether you believe you can do it." That conversation stayed with me during the drive home to Riverside. I thought about all the women I had met who had been convinced they were incapable of understanding finance, when what they really lacked was encouragement and someone who believed in their potential. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made a decision that would change the direction of my life once again. I called Carol and told her I wanted to start a consulting business focused on helping women build investment portfolios and financial confidence. "Sarah," she said, "that's a brilliant idea. You have the credibility, the experience, and the communication skills to help women who are in exactly the situation you were in 15 years ago." 6 months later, I opened Sarah Mitchell Financial Consulting in a small office downtown. My first clients were women from my Resource Center classes. But word spread quickly through networks of divorced women, single mothers, and women who were simply tired of being told they couldn't understand money. My approach was different from traditional financial advisors. Instead of managing clients' money for them, I taught them how to research investments, evaluate companies, and build portfolios that reflected their own values and goals. I wanted every woman who worked with me to feel the same sense of empowerment that I had experienced when I realized I could make my own financial decisions. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, had become my unofficial business partner. She helped me create educational materials, managed my social media presence, and often sat in on client meetings to take notes and ask questions. Watching her interact with women who were learning to believe in their own capabilities was a constant reminder of why this work mattered so much. "Mom," she said one evening as we were closing the office, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had never started investing? If you had just accepted what Dad said about your abilities?" I considered her question carefully. I think I would have spent the rest of my life feeling like I wasn't living up to my potential. But I also think I would have passed that limitation on to you and Jake, and that would have been the real tragedy. "What do you mean?" "I mean that children learn more from what they see than from what they're told. If you had grown up watching me accept that I was too stupid to understand money, you might have learned to accept similar limitations about yourself." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "So by proving them wrong, you weren't just changing your own life, you were changing ours too." "Exactly. And hopefully you'll pass that lesson on to your own children someday." 2 years after starting my consulting business, I was asked to testify before a state legislative committee about financial literacy education. The committee was considering requiring personal finance courses in high school, and they wanted to hear from practitioners about what such curricula should include. Sitting in the legislative hearing room, I thought about the journey that had brought me from a courtroom where I was described as financially incompetent to a place where lawmakers were asking for my expert opinion on financial education policy. The transformation still felt somewhat surreal, but it also felt earned. "Committee members," I began, "I believe that financial literacy education should focus not just on technical skills, but on building confidence and critical thinking. Too many people, particularly women, are taught to believe that finance is too complicated for them to understand. We need to change that narrative. I testified about the importance of starting financial education early, about the need to address gender disparities in financial confidence, and about the value of teaching investment principles alongside basic budgeting skills. The committee members asked thoughtful questions, and I could see that they were genuinely interested in understanding how to better prepare young people for financial independence. After the hearing, the committee chair, a woman named Assemblywoman Rodriguez, approached me privately. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "your testimony was compelling, but I have to ask, how did you develop this expertise? Your background materials mention that you were a stay-at-home mother for many years." I smiled, recognizing the same assumptions that had once frustrated me but now seemed like opportunities for education. "Assemblywoman Rodriguez," I said, "I think that's exactly the kind of thinking we need to change. Being a stay-at-home mother didn't prevent me from learning about finance any more than being a professional would have guaranteed that I understood it. I developed expertise the same way anyone does, through study, practice, and experience." She nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "You're absolutely right. I made an assumption I shouldn't have made." "It's a common assumption," I assured her, "but it's one that keeps many capable people from pursuing financial education because they've been told it's not for them." That evening, I called Jennifer to tell her about the legislative hearing. She had followed my business success with the same satisfaction she had shown during our divorce proceedings, and she often referred clients to me who needed help building financial confidence. "Sarah," she said, "do you realize how far you've come? 2 years ago, you were sitting in my office afraid that you wouldn't be able to support yourself after your divorce. Now you're advising state legislators on financial education policy." "Sometimes I can't believe it myself," I admitted. "But I think that's part of the lesson. We often underestimate our own potential because we let other people define what we're capable of achieving." "What's next for you?" Jennifer asked. "Any plans to expand the business or take on new challenges?" I looked around my apartment, which I had decorated entirely according to my own taste for the first time in my adult life. My investment portfolio statements were spread across the dining table, showing continued growth and diversification. Emma's college applications were stacked nearby, and I felt confident that I could support her education without worrying about the financial burden. "I think I want to write a book," I said. "Something that tells the whole story about how I built wealth while being underestimated, but also practical advice for other women who want to start investing." "That's a fantastic idea," Jennifer said. "Your story could help thousands of women who are in the same situation you were in." 6 months later, I finished the manuscript for The Invisible Investor: How I Built Wealth While Being Underestimated. The book combined my personal story with practical investment advice, financial literacy education, and encouragement for women who had been told they weren't smart enough to handle their own money. The book launch event was held at the same community center where I had first started teaching financial literacy classes. The room was packed with women I had worked with over the years, many of whom had built their own investment portfolios and gained confidence in their financial decision-making abilities. As I signed copies of the book and talked with women who shared their own stories of financial empowerment, I thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. It had started with a grandmother's inheritance and a desire to learn something new. It had continued through years of quiet research and careful investment decisions. It had accelerated through a divorce that forced me to reveal capabilities I had kept hidden for too long. But most importantly, it had led to a life where I was finally living as the person I had always been, instead of the person others expected me to be. Brad attended the book launch, which surprised me. He had remarried Tom the previous year, and they seemed to have settled into a life that suited them both. He approached me during the reception, carrying a copy of my book. "I wanted to congratulate you," he said, "and to tell you that I am proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you," I said. "That means something, coming from you." "I've learned a lot about myself over the past few years," he said. "About how I treated you, about the assumptions I made, about the opportunities I missed to really know who you were." "We both learned things," I said. "I learned that I can't let other people's expectations limit what I try to achieve." "Will you sign my book?" he asked, and I could see genuine respect in his expression. I wrote, "To Brad, Sometimes the most important lessons come from understanding how wrong we were about each other. Thank you for the unintended gift of underestimating me. Sarah. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, I stood in the empty community center, where my journey as a financial educator had begun. Emma helped me pack up the remaining books and promotional materials, chatting excitedly about the people she had met and the stories she had heard. "Mom," she said as we loaded boxes into my car, "I've been thinking about what I want to study in college." "Oh? What are you considering?" "I want to study business and finance, but I also want to take courses in women's studies and psychology. I think I want to understand why women are taught to doubt their own capabilities, and I want to figure out how to change that." I looked at my daughter, who had grown up watching her mother transform from someone who accepted others' limitations to someone who helped other women overcome those same barriers. She was planning a future built on the understanding that she could achieve anything she was willing to work for. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work the world needs," I said, "and I think you're exactly the right person to do it." As we drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from a courtroom where I was mocked for my supposed poverty to a place where I was helping other women build wealth and confidence. The woman who had once sat silently while being described as financially helpless had become someone who was changing how an entire generation of women thought about their own capabilities. The most satisfying part wasn't the money I had made or the recognition I had received. It was the knowledge that I had stopped letting other people's assumptions define what I was capable of achieving. And even more importantly, I had helped hundreds of other women do the same thing. My phone buzzed with a text message from one of my first clients, a woman who had started investing with $200 and had now built a portfolio worth over $50,000. "Sarah," the message read, "I just wanted to thank you again for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. I closed on my first house today and I paid cash. None of this would have been possible without everything you taught me about investing and about trusting my own judgment." I smiled and forwarded the message to Emma, who replied immediately with a series of celebrating emojis and a note. "This is why your work matters so much, Mom. You're not just teaching people about money, you're teaching them about their own potential." That night, I updated my investment portfolio and reviewed my financial goals for the coming year. My wealth had grown to over $1.2 million, but more importantly, I had built a life that felt authentically mine. I had work that mattered, relationships that were based on mutual respect, and children who understood that their capabilities were limited only by their own efforts and imagination. The woman who had once been mocked for her poverty had become someone who was helping others build not just wealth, but the confidence to pursue their own dreams without asking permission from anyone else. And that, I thought as I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, was worth more than any stock portfolio could ever be. 5 years had passed since that transformative day in Judge Williams' courtroom, and I was standing in the green room of a national television studio in New York City, adjusting my blazer and reviewing my notes one final time before appearing on a major financial news program. The producer had contacted me after reading my book, wanting me to discuss the growing trend of women taking control of their own investments and the barriers that still prevented many from building wealth. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman Brad had once described as too stupid to understand basic financial concepts was about to be interviewed as an expert on national television. But the nervousness I felt wasn't about my qualifications or knowledge. It was the same anticipation I had experienced before every major step in my journey, the recognition that I was about to push myself into new territory that would require growth and courage. My consulting business had expanded beyond anything I had originally envisioned. What had started as one-on-one sessions with divorced women in Riverside had grown into a company with 12 employees, satellite offices in 3 cities, and corporate contracts to provide financial literacy training to major employers. We had helped over 2,000 women build investment portfolios, and our clients' collective wealth had grown to over $30 million. Emma, now a senior at UCLA studying business and psychology, had spent her summer internship with my company, developing a curriculum specifically designed for college-aged women. Her research had revealed that many young women graduated with significant student debt but no understanding of how to build wealth or plan for their financial futures. The program she created, which we called Investing in Yourself, had been adopted by 17 universities and was showing remarkable results in changing how young women thought about money and their own capabilities. "Mom," Emma had said during our most recent planning meeting, "I've been tracking the participants from our first pilot program, and the results are incredible. Not only are they investing in building wealth, but they're also negotiating higher salaries, starting businesses, and making major life decisions from a position of financial confidence instead of fear." Jake, now 19 and studying entrepreneurship at UC San Diego, had launched his own business developing financial education apps for teenagers. His first app, which gamified the process of learning about compound interest and investment basics, had been downloaded over 100,000 times and featured in several business magazines as an innovative approach to financial literacy. Watching both of my children build careers based on the understanding that financial knowledge was power, not privilege, had been one of the most satisfying aspects of my transformation. They had grown up seeing their mother go from being dismissed as financially incompetent to being recognized as an expert whose advice was sought by individuals, corporations, and government agencies. The television interview went better than I had hoped. The host, a sharp woman named Patricia Chang, had done her research and asked thoughtful questions about the psychological barriers that prevented women from investing, the systemic factors that perpetuated financial inequality, and the practical steps that individuals could take to build wealth regardless of their starting point. "Sarah," Patricia said during the segment, "your story is remarkable because you built substantial wealth while being systematically underestimated by the person closest to you. What would you say to women who are currently in similar situations?" "I would tell them that other people's assumptions about your capabilities have absolutely no bearing on what you're actually capable of achieving," I replied. "The most important thing is to start, even if you start small. Every woman I work with has the intelligence to understand investing. What they often lack is confidence, and someone who believes in their potential. You've mentioned that you see investing as fundamentally about research and analysis, rather than risk-taking or speculation. Can you explain what you mean by that?" When most people think about the stock market, they imagine gambling or trying to predict short-term price movements, I said. But successful investing is really about understanding businesses, evaluating their competitive advantages, and making informed decisions about which companies are likely to grow over time. It's the same kind of analytical thinking that women use every day when they research major purchases or evaluate options for their families. After the interview, I received dozens of messages from women who had seen the program and wanted to share their own stories or ask for advice. One message particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Angela in Phoenix who wrote that she had been told by her financial advisor that she was too emotional to handle her own investment decisions and should stick to savings accounts and CDs. "I saw your interview and realized that my advisor was wrong," Angela wrote. "I've spent the last 2 weeks researching companies and learning about different investment strategies. I'm not too emotional, I'm just uninformed. And that's something I can fix." I forwarded Angela's message to Emma, who was working on her senior thesis about financial empowerment and gender dynamics. She had been collecting stories from women who had overcome assumptions about their financial capabilities, and Angela's experience fit perfectly into the research Emma was conducting. "Mom, this is exactly what I'm finding in my interviews," Emma texted back. "Women aren't naturally bad with money. They're systematically discouraged from learning about it, and then blamed for their lack of knowledge. The success of my television appearance led to speaking opportunities at major conferences and business schools. I found myself addressing audiences of MBA students, corporate executives, and financial professionals about the importance of recognizing and developing talent that was often overlooked or underestimated. One particularly memorable presentation was at Harvard Business School, where I spoke to a room full of future business leaders about unconscious bias in financial services and the economic benefits of encouraging broader participation in wealth-building activities. When we assume that certain groups of people aren't capable of understanding finance, I told the students, we're not just limiting those individuals. We're limiting the entire economy by preventing talented people from building wealth and starting businesses. During the question and answer session, a male student raised his hand and asked, But isn't it true that some people just aren't naturally good with numbers and analysis? I smiled, recognizing the same assumptions that had once been made about me. I think the question isn't whether people are naturally good with numbers, I replied. The question is whether they've been given the opportunity and encouragement to develop those skills. I've worked with thousands of women who were told they weren't analytical or mathematical, and I've watched them learn to evaluate complex financial information and make sophisticated investment decisions. But surely there are innate differences in aptitude, the student persisted. Perhaps, I said, but I've learned that aptitude matters far less than opportunity and confidence. The women I work with don't succeed because they're financial geniuses. They succeed because they're willing to learn, and because someone finally told them they were capable of learning. After the Harvard presentation, the dean of the business school approached me about developing a case study based on my experience for use in their MBA curriculum. The idea that my divorce and portfolio revelation would become teaching material for future business leaders felt surreal, but also deeply satisfying. Sarah, the dean said, your story illustrates several important principles about leadership, communication, and recognizing talent. I think our students would benefit from analyzing the dynamics of your marriage and divorce from a business perspective. Working with the Harvard faculty to develop the case study forced me to examine my own experience from new angles. What had been a personal story of empowerment became a lesson about organizational behavior, gender dynamics, and the costs of making assumptions about people's capabilities. The case study, titled The Invisible Investor: Recognition, Assumptions, and Hidden Talent, was published the following year and became one of the most requested materials in the business school's curriculum. Students analyzed Brad's failure to recognize my capabilities, the systemic factors that had enabled my investments to remain hidden, and the strategic decisions I had made during the divorce proceedings. One student's analysis particularly struck me. She wrote, Sarah Mitchell's case demonstrates that talent development requires both opportunity and belief. Mrs. Mitchell had the opportunity to invest through access to household funds, but she lacked belief from others in her capabilities. Her success suggests that organizations and individuals who fail to recognize hidden talent are making costly strategic errors. Reading that analysis, written by a 25-year-old MBA student, made me realize how far the conversation about women and finance had evolved. The student was analyzing my experience not as an unusual exception, but as an example of systemic problems that could be identified and addressed through better leadership and organizational practices. My consulting business continued to grow, but I found myself increasingly focused on larger systemic changes rather than individual client work. I testified before Congress about retirement security and gender wealth gaps. I advised corporate human resources departments about financial wellness programs. I worked with pension funds and investment firms to develop products and services that better served women investors. The most ambitious project I undertook was partnering with a major university to establish the Mitchell Center for Financial Empowerment, a research institute focused on understanding and addressing the barriers that prevented women, minorities, and other underrepresented groups from building wealth. The center's first major research project was a longitudinal study of women who had participated in financial education programs, tracking their investment behavior, wealth accumulation, and career progression over time. The preliminary results were remarkable, showing that women who received targeted financial education and encouragement not only built more wealth than control groups, but also showed increased confidence in other areas of their lives. What we're seeing, explained Dr. Maria Santos, the center's research director, is that financial empowerment has spillover effects. Women who learn to trust their judgment about investments also become more likely to negotiate for higher salaries, start businesses, and take on leadership roles. Emma joined the center as a research associate after graduating from UCLA, and together we began developing a comprehensive program for high schools that would teach both financial literacy and financial confidence. The curriculum included not just technical information about budgeting and investing, but also modules on recognizing and overcoming societal messages that discourage certain groups from pursuing financial knowledge. I want teenage girls to grow up knowing that understanding money is just another life skill they can master, Emma said during one of our planning sessions. I don't want them to reach adulthood thinking that finance is some mysterious masculine domain that they're not smart enough to enter. The high school program was piloted in 12 districts across California, with remarkable results. Students who completed the program showed not only improved financial knowledge, but also increased confidence in their mathematical and analytical abilities. Female students, in particular, showed significant improvements in their willingness to consider careers in business, finance, and entrepreneurship. One of the program evaluations included a comment from a 17-year-old student named Maria, who wrote, "Before this class, I thought investing was just gambling for rich people. Now I understand that it's about researching companies and making informed decisions about the future. I've started a portfolio with money from my part-time job, and I feel like I'm taking control of my future instead of just hoping things work out." Reading Maria's comment reminded me of my own 17-year-old self, full of curiosity and ambition, but never imagining that I could build wealth through my own intelligence and effort. The fact that we were reaching young women before they absorbed societal messages about their financial limitations felt like the most important work I had ever done. 7 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected phone call from Mike Chen, Brad's former attorney. He was calling to ask if I would be willing to speak at his law firm's annual retreat about recognizing hidden assets and capabilities during divorce proceedings. "Sarah," he said, "I have to admit that your case completely changed how I approach family law. I've learned to look more carefully at both spouses' actual capabilities rather than making assumptions based on traditional roles or apparent financial sophistication." The irony of being asked to train divorce attorneys about the mistakes that had been made in my own case was not lost on me, but I agreed to speak because I recognized the opportunity to influence how other women might be treated during their own divorces. My presentation to the law firm focused on the importance of thorough financial discovery, the dangers of making assumptions about clients' capabilities, and the need to recognize that financial sophistication could exist in unexpected forms. I shared data showing that women who were underestimated during divorce proceedings often achieved better long-term financial outcomes than predicted, suggesting that attorneys and judges needed to develop better methods for assessing actual rather than apparent financial competence. "The lesson from my own case," I told the attorneys, "is that assumptions about financial capability are often wrong, and those wrong assumptions can lead to inadequate settlements and custody arrangements that don't serve anyone's best interests." During the question and answer session, a female attorney asked, "What signs should we look for to identify clients who might have hidden financial capabilities?" "I think the better question," I replied, "is what assumptions should we avoid making? Don't assume that someone who hasn't worked outside the home lacks business sense. Don't assume that someone who speaks quietly lacks analytical ability. Don't assume that someone who defers to their spouse lacks independent judgment. And definitely don't assume that traditional gender roles reflect actual capabilities." After my presentation, several attorneys approached me privately to share their own experiences with cases where they had initially underestimated clients who later proved to be more financially sophisticated than expected. One attorney told me about a client who had appeared to be a dependent spouse but had actually been managing a substantial real estate portfolio that her husband knew nothing about. "Your case taught me to ask different questions and listen more carefully to the answers," the attorney said. "I've probably doubled my success rate in financial settlements just by getting better at recognizing what my clients are actually capable of achieving." 8 years after the divorce, Brad and I found ourselves working together on an unexpected project. Emma had asked both of her parents to participate in her doctoral dissertation research about family financial dynamics and the long-term effects of divorce on children's financial education. Sitting across from Brad in Emma's apartment as she interviewed us about our marriage, our divorce, and our current perspectives was strange but not uncomfortable. The anger and resentment that had characterized our interactions during the divorce proceedings had faded into something more like mutual respect, tinged with regret about opportunities missed. "Dad," Emma asked Brad, "looking back, what do you think prevented you from recognizing Mom's financial capabilities during your marriage?" Brad was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think I was so invested in being the financial expert in our family that I couldn't see evidence that contradicted that role," he said. "Your mother would try to discuss investments or share research she had done, and instead of listening, I would dismiss it because accepting her expertise would have threatened my identity as the provider and decision-maker." "Mom," Emma continued, "why do you think you didn't insist on being recognized for your financial knowledge?" "I think I believed that keeping peace in the marriage was more important than getting credit for my capabilities," I replied. "I also think I underestimated the cost of staying silent. I thought I was just avoiding conflict. but I was actually allowing both of us to live in a fiction that ultimately damaged our relationship and limited both of our potential. Emma's research was part of a larger academic project, examining how traditional gender roles in marriage affected financial decision-making and wealth building. Her preliminary findings suggested that couples who shared financial responsibilities and recognized both partners' capabilities accumulated significantly more wealth over time than couples where one partner dominated financial decisions. What's fascinating, Emma explained, is that the data shows mom and dad actually would have been much wealthier if they had combined their approaches to money management. Dad's income generation skills and mom's investment expertise could have been incredibly powerful together, but the assumption that only one person should handle finances prevented them from maximizing their potential. Jake, who was now 24 and running a successful financial technology company, had been following Emma's research with great interest. His own experience growing up had taught him that financial knowledge was not gender-specific, and he had built his company's products around the principle that everyone could learn to make good financial decisions if given the right tools and encouragement. "The thing that strikes me about mom and dad's story," Jake said during one of our family dinners, "is how much talent and potential was wasted because of assumptions and stereotypes. Imagine if they had been a team from the beginning, combining dad's earning power with mom's investment skills. They probably could have retired 10 years early and been much happier." His observation reminded me that the costs of underestimating people's capabilities extended far beyond the individuals directly affected. When societies, organizations, or families fail to recognize and develop talent, everyone loses potential benefits that could have been created through collaboration and mutual recognition. 10 years after the divorce, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual conference of the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors. The theme of the conference was Recognizing Hidden Talent in Financial Services, and the organizers wanted me to speak about the broader implications of my experience for the financial planning profession. Standing before an audience of several hundred financial professionals, I reflected on how dramatically the conversation about women and investing had changed since my divorce. What had once been treated as an unusual exception was now recognized as part of a larger pattern of overlooked talent and missed opportunities. 10 years ago, I began, I was described in a courtroom as too stupid to understand basic financial concepts. Today, I'm standing before you as someone whose investment strategies are taught in business schools, and whose research on financial empowerment influences policy at the federal level. The question we need to ask ourselves is, how many other people are we underestimating right now? My speech focused on the economic benefits of recognizing hidden talent, the importance of questioning assumptions about who could be a successful investor, and the need for financial services to develop better methods for identifying and nurturing capabilities that might not be immediately obvious. The financial services industry has historically been designed by and for a relatively narrow demographic, I said. But we're living in a world where the most dynamic economic growth is coming from previously underrepresented groups. If we want to remain relevant and successful, we need to get much better at recognizing talent wherever it exists. After my keynote, I was approached by representatives from several major investment firms who wanted to discuss consulting arrangements to help them better serve women investors and identify potential talent among their own employees. The fact that companies were willing to pay substantial fees for advice that essentially boiled down to, quote, "stop making assumptions about people's capabilities," showed how far the industry still had to go. One particularly meaningful conversation was with the chief investment officer of a major pension fund, who told me that my story had inspired her organization to re-examine their hiring and promotion practices. "We realized that we were probably overlooking qualified candidates because they didn't fit our traditional model of what a successful investor looked like," she said. "We've started focusing more on analytical thinking and research skills rather than credentials and self-promotion, and we're finding talent in places we never thought to look before." 11 years after the divorce, Emma completed her doctoral dissertation and accepted a position as an assistant professor at Stanford Business School, where she would continue researching financial empowerment and gender dynamics in business. Her first academic paper, based on our family's experience and her broader research, was published in the Harvard Business Review under the title, "The Hidden Cost of Financial Assumptions." Jake's financial technology company had grown to employ over 100 people and had developed apps and platforms that had helped millions of people learn about investing and build wealth. He had been recognized as one of the most innovative young entrepreneurs in financial technology, and his products were being used by schools, corporations, and financial advisors around the world. Watching both of my children build successful careers based on the principle that financial knowledge should be accessible to everyone felt like the ultimate validation of the choices I had made during and after my divorce. They had learned not just that they could achieve anything they were willing to work for, but that they had a responsibility to help others recognize their own potential. My consulting business had evolved into something I never could have imagined when I first started teaching financial literacy classes at the Women's Resource Center. We now worked with Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and international organizations to develop financial empowerment programs. Our research and methodologies were being used in over 30 countries, and we had helped establish similar centers and programs on 4 continents. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my work was the individual stories of transformation that continued to emerge from our programs. Every month, I received messages from women who had started investing, launched businesses, or made major life changes after participating in our educational initiatives. One message that particularly moved me came from a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, a name that took me a moment to place until I realized it was Judge Williams, who had presided over my divorce proceedings 12 years earlier. Sarah, her message read, "I've been following your career since your court case, and I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. Your case was one of the most memorable of my career, not just because of the dramatic revelation about your portfolio, but because it taught me to look more carefully at the people who appear before my bench. I've become much better at recognizing hidden capabilities and potential, and I think I've made better decisions as a result." Judge Williams went on to explain that she had recently retired from the bench and was beginning a second career as a mediator specializing in complex financial disputes. She had been studying my research and methodologies and wondered if I would be willing to consult on some particularly challenging cases. "I've learned that the most important question in any financial dispute isn't who has more money or who appears more sophisticated," she wrote. "The important question is who has the actual capability to build and manage wealth going forward. Your case taught me that those capabilities often exist in unexpected places." Working with Judge Williams on mediation cases proved to be both professionally rewarding and personally healing. The woman who had once ruled on my divorce was now my colleague, and together we were helping other families navigate financial disputes with more wisdom and insight than either of us had possessed 12 years earlier. 13 years after the divorce, I was contacted by a major publishing house about writing a second book. This one focused not on my personal story, but on the broader research and methodologies that had emerged from my work in financial empowerment. The book would be aimed at policymakers, business leaders, and anyone interested in understanding how to recognize and develop economic talent more effectively. The Hidden Economy of Talent took me 3 years to write, combining academic research with case studies from my consulting work and interviews with women around the world who had overcome assumptions about their financial capabilities. The book documented the economic costs of underestimating people's potential and provided specific strategies for organizations and societies to better identify and develop hidden talent. The book's publication coincided with my appointment to serve on a United Nations commission studying global economic inequality and women's empowerment. The commission's mandate was to develop recommendations for governments and international organizations about policies and programs that could increase women's participation in wealth-building activities and entrepreneurship. Sitting in UN conference rooms in New York and Geneva, participating in discussions about global economic policy, I often thought about the journey that had brought me from a courthouse in Riverside, California, to these international forums. The woman who had once been mocked for her supposed poverty was now advising world leaders about economic empowerment and talent development. But the most meaningful moments weren't in the high-level policy discussions. They were in the smaller sessions where we heard directly from women around the world who had overcome barriers to build businesses, accumulate wealth, and transform their communities. Their stories reminded me that behind every economic statistic was a person who had refused to accept others' limitations on their potential. 15 years after the divorce, I received a call from Emma, now an associate professor at Stanford and a leading researcher on financial empowerment, with news that would close a circle in the most satisfying way possible. "Mom," she said, I've been asked to establish a new research center at Stanford focused on economic inequality and talent development. The university wants to name it the Sarah Mitchell Center for Economic Empowerment. The idea that my name would be associated with a research institution dedicated to helping people recognize and develop their economic potential felt like the ultimate transformation. The woman who had once been described as financially incompetent would have an academic center named in her honor, focused on the principle that economic talent exists everywhere and should be recognized and nurtured. At the center's dedication ceremony, I was asked to give a speech about the principles and values that would guide its work. Standing before an audience that included Emma, Jake, many of my former clients, colleagues from around the world, and even Brad and his family, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us all to this moment. 15 years ago, I began, I learned that the most dangerous assumption we can make is that we know what other people are capable of achieving. Today, we dedicate this center to the principle that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity and recognition do not. I spoke about the importance of curiosity over assumptions, of asking questions rather than making judgments, and of creating systems and institutions that helped people discover and develop their own potential, rather than limiting them based on others' expectations. The work of this center will be based on a simple but powerful idea, I concluded. Every person deserves the opportunity to discover what they're truly capable of achieving. Our job is to remove the barriers that prevent that discovery, and to create environments where hidden talent can emerge and flourish. After the ceremony, Brad approached me with a smile that looked genuinely proud. "Sarah," he said, "I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again in front of our kids. I'm sorry for all the years I failed to see who you really were, and I'm incredibly proud of what you've built from that failure." "Thank you," I said. "But I want you to know that I don't think of it as built from failure. I think of it as built from the discovery that we're all capable of, more than we realize." That evening, Emma, Jake, and I had dinner together at a restaurant overlooking the Stanford campus. As we talked about the center's plans and the research projects that would emerge from it, I felt a deep sense of completion and anticipation. "Mom," Jake said, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had never gotten divorced? If Dad had never forced you to reveal your portfolio in court?" "I think about it sometimes," I said, "but I've realized that the portfolio was never really the point. The point was learning to trust my own judgment and refusing to accept other people's definitions of what I was capable of achieving. And now thousands of other women have learned the same thing because of your work," Emma added. "You took something painful and transformed it into something that's changing the world." Looking out at the Stanford campus, where young people from around the world came to learn and grow and discover their own potential, I thought about all the women I had worked with over the years who had made similar transformations. Each of them had started from a place of being underestimated or dismissed, and each had learned to trust their own capabilities and build something meaningful. The woman who had once sat silently while being described as financially helpless had become someone who helped others find their voices and their power. The transformation hadn't been about becoming someone different. It had been about finally becoming who I had always been, without apology or limitation. As we finished dinner and prepared to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from Angela, the woman from Phoenix who had contacted me years earlier after seeing my television interview. Her message included a photo of herself at a podium, speaking at a financial conference. "Sarah," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that I'm now a financial advisor myself, specializing in helping women who have been told they're not smart enough to handle their own money. I trace everything back to that moment when I saw you on TV and realized that I wasn't too emotional to invest. I was just uninformed. Thank you for showing me that there's no limit to what we can achieve when we stop accepting other people's assumptions about our capabilities." Reading Angela's message as we walked across the Stanford campus, surrounded by the promise of future discoveries and achievements, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that your life has made a difference. The pain of being underestimated had been transformed into the power to help others recognize their own potential. And in the end, that transformation had been worth more than any stock portfolio could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.